there's been a lot of talk in the last, just about last year, about secular stagnation. All of a sudden, this really old term, this really old concept that goes back to the 40s, has made a reappearance among serious people. And just to say right away, I find that a lot of people, even economists, get this mixed up with or aren't drawing a firm line between this new secular stagnation and just the stagflation or the general notion of economic stagnation. So they think it's that there's a different set of stuff. There's the kind of Tyler Cowen or Bob Gordon stuff saying the engine of technology is slowly grinding to a halt, and the old the Peter Thiel line about we were promised flying cars and instead we got 140 characters, and that is that's an interesting discussion. Has technology, is it really disappointing? Are we running to the end of rapid growth, for basically rapid growth in the supply side? But that's not this question. This is really, in a way, it's an unfortunate term that we use here, but it's not. It means something quite different. So just as a reminder, if we actually look at what's happening right now, so you will see people who will look in particular at the problems of Europe and say, oh, it's Eurosclerosis, which we talked about a lot in the 80s and the 90s. It's the kind of problem where there aren't incentives to work, and so labor markets, employers don't want to create jobs. But that was a world in which the limit to growth was that when you try to reflate the economy, instead you just got inflation. So the reason that we knew that there was a lot of trouble with European labor markets in the 80s and 90s was that whenever unemployment got down to 9%, inflation seemed to accelerate. So it looked like the NAIRU, the natural rate of unemployment, was 9% or something. That's not what's happening now. What's happening now is instead that they can't get the inflation they want, that the European Central Bank is supposed to achieve close to but below 2%, which is a weird formulation, but that's a whole other story. And the United States, the Fed is trying to do 2%, and we're not succeeding in that. Instead, we're having a problem. We just can't seem to get enough demand. Now, there's been a story that many of us have told, which is we had an explosion of debt, we had a financial crisis, now we've got deleveraging, and so that's how you get into that situation where for a while it's really hard to generate enough demand, that even if the central bank cuts interest rates to zero, that's not enough. But it's a transitory thing. Secular stagnation is about, well, maybe it's not quite so transitory. Maybe we actually have something that is going to make this a much more common, maybe even the norm, for quite a while looking forwards. So if I can I have to tie it to economics pedagogy a little bit. If you go back, the undergraduate economics teaching as we know it began in 1948 when Paul Samuelson came out with the first edition. I think you can still buy a freshly reprinted but facsimile of the first Samuelson. And that was taught very differently from the way we do principles today, because it begins with macro. And the first half of the book is about how you can use mostly fiscal policy to achieve full employment. And the reason Samuelson felt he had to do that, was that the Great Depression was still fresh in people's memory. And the Great Depression was not a short thing. There was a long period of very high unemployment. And all of the stuff that we now talk about, choices among competing ends, allocation of scarce resources, that wasn't going to make much sense to students who thought of a world where, what do you mean scarce resources? My uncle can't get a job. So it was Samuelson back then had to write first, we'll talk about how the government can ensure full employment, and then we get back to the trade-offs that are the staple of economics. That went away. Over the decades went by, the Great Depression did not come back. We started to think, okay, we've got this thing under control. Micro moved from the second half of the book to the first half. Everything, we changed it all, and thought that this was basically not going to come back. That central banks, the Fed knew what it was going to do. When Milton Friedman had his 90th birthday, the Fed actually held a conference, and Ben Bernanke said, on behalf of the Fed, I'd like to say that you were right, we did it, but thanks to you, we won't do it again. So now that we have Friedman and Schwartz, now that we understand monetary policy, there will never again be anything like the Great Depression. Whoops. So, and what's interesting about this, oh, and just to say, since of course we're flanking books here, one of the things Robin and I did in the first edition, we made a judgment, which was that the many principles books had taken business cycle macro and shrunk it down to one or two chapters tucked near the end of the book. And we said, you know, we still think the business cycle is important. I think that's had a lot to do with the fact that I had paid so much attention to the Asian financial crisis and to Japan, and was aware that that these things had not gone away in the rest of the world, and if it could happen to the Japanese, maybe it could happen to us. But still, that was a difference. And that has turned out, of course, to be a good decision to keep the business cycle in there. So if you take a look at, so we've had recessions, we've had some nasty business cycle events, but it's starting to look like more than that. The big thing has been that monetary policy turns out to be a lot less omnipotent than we thought. Actually, I used to say, when Alan Greenspan was there, I used to say Greenspan was omnipotent but not omniscient. That he could do whatever he wanted, but he didn't always know what was happening. That turns out, even the first part turns out not to be true, because you can't reduce interest rates below zero. And there are other things you can do, but we argue a lot about how effective they are. And the main thing to say is that this situation where the Fed has cut rates all the way to zero, and it's not enough, and inflation is below target and unemployment still seems high, we're now just about at the 6th anniversary. Right? It's really well, actually a little bit past. Basically, it starts with the fall of Lehman, although we were pretty close even before, and that was more than 6 years ago. So we've now had 6 full years. The Fed, if you look at the minutes, they think they're going to raise rates off zero sometime next year, but they're getting a little uncertain about that. It's by no means clear. So it's quite likely that we'll have 7 years or more of zero rates. Europe looks nowhere close to a liftoff point. So actually, even on just on those grounds, if you were going to say, you know, what's your maximum likelihood estimate of this fraction of the time that we spend against the zero lower bound, basically not having the tools to produce full employment. And at this point now, of the past 30 years, we've spent 6 on the floor. Looks like more. So already it's starting to look like this is a much more likely event than we thought. And the secular stagnation argument is that there are underlying changes in the economy that are going to make this even more likely in the future. That what we are experiencing now may well be, if not the constant state of the economy, possibly the normal state, or at least a frequent state, which is really, it really changes how you want to talk about economics, if that's true. Has a lot of other consequences as well, but let me talk through that a bit. So how is it, why would we say that it's not just that turns out that it's a larger fraction of the time than we thought? There are a couple of things you can look at. One is to say that if you look across the last several business cycles, it has in fact seemed to be getting harder and harder to restore full employment. And one way to look at that is to ask, what about real interest rates? How low has the Fed had to bring the real interest rate in order to get the economy back on a solid recovery? And so I did this is a very crude, but I think not bad exercise, just taking the effective federal funds rate minus a core rate of inflation, and across, so peak to peak, across 3 business cycles. And each successive cycle, it's taken a lower interest rate to get the economy moving again. So in the 80s, Paul Volcker brought rates down to rates that were actually still, in nominal terms, quite high. But that was enough. It was morning in America. The economy exploded upwards. During the early 90s, we were already starting to talk about, is this a liquidity trap coming back? It turned out that the early 90s recession was quite hard to end, which is why, among other things, it was a prolonged jobless recovery. The aftermath of the dot-com crash was even harder to get out of. It took a long time. People forget just how long it was before finally a housing boom got us out. And of course, this time around, we've had negative real interest rates at the short end for a long time now. And maybe the US is recovering solidly now, maybe. But Europe is not. So Europe is substantially worse. And the story is actually worse than that. So this is a new report, the Geneva report on debt and deleveraging. And it's actually, the title of the report is Deleveraging, What Deleveraging? Look at the blue line. That 2000s business cycle, where it took a very low interest rate to get us up to full employment again, was one in which demand was actually being supported by a lot of borrowing, unsustainable levels of borrowing, not just a brief period, but all through that decade. Mostly that's households. The large government deficits come actually after the crash, and business borrowing has not been that high in the West, although it was a big deal for Japan's version of this, which came quite a lot earlier. So, but you want to think about this. In 2007, we did have something that looked like a full employment economy. But we were only able to have that full employment economy with households borrowing like crazy to buy houses and lots of home construction. Basically, a housing bubble supported by unsustainable borrowing. And that's true on average across the whole period. Now, presumably that can't come back, we can't do more of that. And you might and also if you think that the crisis we're in is because well, everybody's paying down debt, and things will return to normal once people have paid down debt. Actually, we're not paying down debt. There is some shift of the debt away from households towards governments, but overall, we're actually not managing even to reduce the debt. So where we are right now is a persistently depressed Western world, which is, it's not deleveraging, it's only just not leveraging as fast as it was in the last decade. That's not a good sign. That tells you that it's a world that really sort of has a fundamental gap in demand. Why would that be happening? Bunches of possible explanations, but I think you can, some of it I think we can say is that the disinflation, probably we might have had a lot more problems along these lines in the 70s and early 80s if we hadn't had much higher rates of inflation then. So getting substantially negative real rates was easy. I look a lot at Europe because actually it turns out if this is the future, in this case the future is happening first in Europe. Lots of different things to say here, but actually the original secular stagnation speech was Alvin Hansen's presidential address to the American Economic Association in, I think it's 1939. And in it, he argued at the time that the United States and the Western world in general was going to have a persistent problem of not enough demand, not enough spending. And his reason was demography. He argued essentially that because population growth was pretty much over, then without a growing population, you don't need to be building lots more houses, you don't need to be building more factories to accommodate a growing workforce, which means there's a lot of investment demand is not going to be there. Now it turned out, of course, that, well first, we had a large program of fiscal stimulus, otherwise known as the Second World War, which was then followed by a demographic explosion, the baby boom. So all of that became a moot point. But the demography is back. The United States has had a sharp decline in the growth of the working age population. That's already happened. It's kind of, the baby boom slid over into the point of starting to retire a few years ago, is not being replaced, but we're still at least somewhat positive. Europe is substantially negative. We've seen this before, which is Japan. Japan, a substantial part, I think, of Japan's problem is that basically a growing shortage of Japanese. That the working age population in Japan has been declining since the late 90s. It's now declining at about 1.5% a year. And really hard to get a lot of investment going when you don't have, when you have a shrinking working age population. That, by the way, that is not at all the same thing as the other associated problem, which is fewer workers to support retirees. So this is not about, this is also an issue for Europe. Who is going to support the seniors? So it's an aging continent, and that's a problem. That's true here significantly, but that's a different issue. Here we're just saying, if you have a shrinking population, certainly a shrinking working age population, how do you get enough investment demand to maintain full employment?